Hello, class, and welcome to Chapter 6, which is all about employment testing. And I think this chapter is incredibly fascinating. If for no other reason, employment tests are one of those things that there are so many different rules out there, specifically state laws on what can and can't be used as an employment test, when it's applicable, when you can and can't use it. So, again, I would never expect you to have to memorize all different 50 states. Obviously, here in Illinois, we have our own unique set of employment testing laws. And most of what we're going to be talking about is related to the federal government, the federal rules on it. But again, states can have their own rules, obviously, just like in a lot of other areas. But several things that I want you to know for employment tests. First thing is about drug testing, which is probably the most common version of employment test. And obviously, we understand, kind of inherently why we do drug testing to make sure somebody is not tested positive for illegal drugs. Specifically, drugs like cocaine and heroin and things along those lines. Now, obviously, because so many states have legalized marijuana in the last several years, that obviously, can play one way or another because again, technically marijuana is still illegal at the federal level, but again, so many states have decriminalized marijuana. So I don't expect you to know the little nuances of state laws when it comes to what is and what is not legal from a drug perspective. But obviously, I think we all inherently understand why we drug test. It's especially on the pre-employment to make sure somebody is not, on illegal drugs, during the pre-employment testing. So obviously, generally, if you were required of all applicants, no problem usually with drug testing. The issues with drug testing kind of become under two different areas. The first one is when you're actually during employment. If somebody, is walking and falls down and breaks a bunch of glass, for example, you might think, oh, I need to drug test them. So generally, as your book talks about, you need to have a reasonable suspicion to drug test somebody randomly or during their employment. So, but generally, in a lot of companies and organizations have policies that, if you're involved in an accident, if you slip and fall, if you break something, generally as part of that company's employment rules and procedures, they'll drug test you just out of reasonable suspicion that the reason that you fell or that you broke something or could be drug related. So if somebody's gonna drug test you during the course of your employment, there needs to be a reasonable suspicion, and your book talks about that. So. And then, you've probably heard about this whole concept about random drug testing, about just randomly selecting individuals to come and test. And again, while most random drug testing is not illegal, organizations can usually do it, you need to have some type of procedure related to it. You can't just walk around and suddenly say, you, and you, come on here, we're going to go drug test. There kind of has to, this is going to sound almost weird, but you have to have a reason to randomly drug test somebody. And again, generally, if you say, okay, this month we're going to pull everybody with the last name L, or this month we're going to put all 100 employees' names in a hat and we're going to draw 5. That shows that there is truly randomness to it. Generally, if you can show that there's true randomness to it, then it's generally okay. But where you become issues with random testing is especially on the lines of, as your book talks about, related to the Fourth Amendment to our Constitution about unreasonable searches and seizures. And again, you can random test, but there's a certain degree and a limit to what you can and can't do. So make sure in your textbook you read about how this is related to the Fourth Amendment and unreasonable searches and seizures. Page 200 of your textbook, I really want you to pay attention to. It lists, I think, 7 steps on what good drug testing procedures would look like. Again, I don't expect you to memorize all 7, but that one might be a test question, so just throwing it out there. So make sure you understand on page 200 the drug testing procedures about what a company or an organization needs to do to make sure that if they do random drug testing, they're doing it legally within kind of the realms. And again, every state has its own unique procedures, and what you see in your textbook could be more or less than what each state has, but again, that's kind of a general rule. So make sure you understand on page 200 the different drug testing procedures. And then going to on medical exams, table 6.1 in your textbook talks about medical exams and when they can and can't be used. I think it's a good idea for you kind of to have a general understanding about when medical exams are appropriate and when they're not appropriate. Obviously, if you're hiring, let's say, an administrative assistant at a small legal office. A medical exam, a full medical exam, probably not relevant to that type of job. For kind of the person's primarily going to be sitting in an office and not a lot of reasons to have a medical exam for that job. Now, if somebody is going to be a stunt devil or a stunt double, like in a movie, for example, yeah, maybe a medical exam might be a good idea. Or obviously, the military does a lot of medical exams for obvious reasons. So make sure at Table 6.1, and I think maybe Table 6.2 do a good job of kind of discussing that when medical exams are appropriate and when they're not. So make sure you have a good understanding of what that is. And where like this relates to my job personally is how it relates to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And again, because if you have, if you're requiring medical exams, but somebody has a disability that would prevent them from successfully passing the medical exam, can you or can you not hire them based on that? Well, and again, that's so situation specific. I can't think of too many details, but make sure in your textbook right around there you understand how medical exams, when they can and when they cannot be utilized. The next topic is right around, I think, page 210 is on genetic testing, and specifically GINA, G-I-N-A, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Essentially, it's a newer employment law, one of the newest employment laws. Basically says you can't discriminate against somebody because of their genetics. Well, that inherently kind of makes sense if you think about it. We don't want to be treating people differently just because they have a different genetic makeup or material than somebody else. So again, I probably won't test you on GINA, G-I-N-A, but make sure you have a basic understanding about what genetic testing involves. And beyond that, there's a section on polygraph tests. And again, we're not going to even worry about polygraph tests. Again, as usual, I do want you to read it so you kind of have a general knowledge, but polygraph testing for the most part is illegal in most states because again, polygraph tests aren't necessarily saying if whether or not you're lying or telling the truth. It's a nature of your blood pulse rate on different psychological aspects. And again, people can beat them very easily on a variety of reasons. So most states have polygraph testing as illegal, or at least in a very, very limited basis. So for our purposes of this class, I'm not even going to quiz you or test you on it, so don't really worry about polygraph tests specifically. Well, the last thing that I want you to know under employment test is on page 222 about things called cutoff scores and race norming. So obviously, if you're using these types of employment tests, let's say you have to take a math test, or you have to take a basic knowledge of your like an on-the-job training to be like a carpenter, for example. There's usually a range of scores that you can do to pass the exam. So obviously, having a cutoff score makes inherent sense so you can determine who passed it and who didn't. And cutoff scores are perfectly fine to have as long as there's information related to how those are developed. Where companies get in trouble is with cutoff scores is the next kind of topic known as race norming. Now, it's called race norming, but it can apply to things not just beyond race. It can apply to age, religion, sex, things along those lines. It's basically when you create different scores for different groups. So you can say, well, if you're above 30, this is the realm, but if you're over 30, this is the realm. Or African Americans are going to have this score, but Hispanic Americans are going to have this score, and Asian Americans are going to have this score. Or, so as a general rule, race norming is illegal for obvious reasons because you're creating different elements for different people. Now, there are some exceptions. Obviously, think of the military. Obviously, with physical activity, they have different, sets of scales for men versus women because of the biological differences between men and women. So in very limited situations, those things can be acceptable, but again, they're very limited, and again, they're not really too common for the purposes of what you and I are talking about in this class. So make sure you understand what race norming is and what can happen when companies create different cutoff scores for different groups of people. So, all right, well, that's it for Chapter 6. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will see you for Chapter 7.